Awesome.
Cool. All right. So, hi, everybody. Great to have you here as part of our first X-Meta community talk, and hopefully a extended series of what we'll bring in the future to the community. We're starting off with a really interesting discussion today with Ivan, and it's really about the power of choosing, not just what you build, but how you build it and who you are while you're doing it. Ivan has spent over 2 decades shaping some of the world's most impactful companies, including Instagram, Facebook, Workday, building up teams, systems, and strategies from scratch. But behind every little milestone, between every title and every milestone, is a person who's chosen to lead with intention, to recover with purpose, and to keep asking the bigger questions. What makes this conversation special isn't just the scale of Ivan's experience, it's the depth of his reflection and how he's turned challenges into clarity, complexity into culture, and ambition into alignment. Ivan, welcome. How are you today?
I'm good. I mean, it's 9 a.m. in Dublin at the moment, and I'm not massively a morning person, but I've had enough tea to keep me going for the next while. Yeah.
Cool, grand. And maybe, I guess, for folks' context, while I'm in Singapore today, I used to live in Dublin in a previous time, so I have an extreme soft spot for Dublin. So it's always nice to hear the twang and hear people that are still back home. So, all right. So I guess maybe to get us started a little bit, you want to just tell us a bit more, Ivan, what's been your career so far, and what's kind of got you to this point today, where you are today?
So no, of course, and Anthony, look, lovely to chat to you. So I often say I've had a slightly atypical career. So originally I actually qualified as a software engineer an awfully long time ago. But not only that, but I qualified specializing in artificial intelligence. And this was back in 2001. So artificial intelligence wasn't really a thing back then. So, qualified as a software engineer, came out, realized I really wasn't a great software engineer, wasn't great at coding, which wasn't good. But also I actually came out into when the dot-com bubble had burst. There weren't any jobs available. So I actually ended up going down a path which defined an awful lot of my career. I went into online advertising. And this was at a time before Google AdWords, pay-per-click, none of that existed. So I cut my teeth on learning how to be an account executive and a relationship manager for agencies in a small company here in Ireland. And then I kind of took off on a little bit of a FANG career. So I was actually an early stage employee in Google for a few years, helping build account management teams and operation teams. I spent a bulk of my career then in Facebook. I still call it Facebook, not Meta. I'm afraid it was Facebook when I joined and after I left. So I actually spent a long time there helping set up the account management efforts for the ads product way back in 2009 at the time. And I moved across a few teams in Facebook, specializing in the advertising side. And then, and I'm sure we'll touch on it more today, I took a little bit of a risk, took a break from my career, took time off to learn again. I did a quick stint self-employed as a consultant. And then the last few years I've spent in Workday. And I'm sure we'll touch on this today as well. I actually went a very different career direction after years focused on online advertising and on account management. I actually went into strategy and operations for sales development, built a function and built a team around that. And then that's what I've been doing for the last few years.
Okay, wow, that's a pretty big arc. Certainly ahead of your time, thinking about going into AI at such an early stage, and maybe after the career discussion, we can see where you're thinking on the AI front as well. But I'd love to kind of know, I mean, how would you then kind of maybe describe yourself, perhaps, if you would just take a step back and objectively just tell the room, to your point, titles, milestones are one thing, but who is Ivan really?
That's a really good question. I look at it in two ways. Number one, I'm a failed careerist. For an awful long time, I chased job title and the next level up and promotion. And we'll definitely touch on this later on. Something happened that made me rethink all of that. And instead of chasing job title or the next level up, now I just chase having an impact and being happy. And to be honest, it's served me well. As a person, like everyone else, I'm still a work in progress. I'm still figuring it out. Like, I am 46 years old and I'm still trying to figure out what I want to be when I grow up. That's the way I look at it. I've learned to experience how short life can be and how fragile. And I love to absolutely butcher a Bob Dylan quote around about now, which is, if you can get up in the morning and go to bed at night, and in between do what you want to do, or in my case, do what makes you happiest, that's a good life. That's the way to live things. And so my life these days is quieter, is the best way to put it. I definitely still have some of my old tendencies. I've always been a workaholic, and that still shines through. But these days it's more just continuously trying to figure out how to be happier, and very slowly getting there. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. I like that proxy, right? Like, do what makes you happy, and are you smiling every day, right? Purpose in life through happiness, I think, it's a great pursuit, right? Okay, so I guess then maybe as we kind of think about happiness and finding perhaps that level of purpose, maybe you want to talk us through a little bit, how you moved through your roles through Google, Instagram, and Facebook. And often really, it seems like having to start something new, right? Pay-per-click wasn't a thing. You move to Google and you start selling pay-per-click. Facebook comes out as this new competitor. You learn how to compete, Facebook versus Google. Workday, completely different, constantly reinventing. So what was that, what's the mental model that you're applying there? How are you getting to those decisions, I guess?
So that's a really good question. When I talk about all my FANG experience of the larger ones, what I don't mention is, in between each job is about a year spent with an Irish company in each case, none of whom are around anymore. So I sometimes feel I'm a really good example for also making bad decisions career-wise. So if I look at a lot of the decisions I've made. So when I started in the startup world, I learned an awful lot in that. Google was a very positive experience in terms of joining. I had some friends who joined, and it was very early days, really, really good environment. I'll be honest, I left Google for a very particular reason. At the time, I was kind of helping support me and my partner. They had started their own business. And so honestly, I left Google looking for more money just to keep us afloat. And being very honest, a bad career decision. I did well in the company I was in afterwards, but wasn't happy at all. And so Facebook was, again, I was approached by somebody I knew in Google, and that's actually a common thread. The power of your network. Essentially, people who knew me from Google approached me in Facebook. At the time, it was somebody I'd worked with, and it was also somebody who heads up a few teams in Facebook, and then or in Google. And then joining Facebook was an interesting one, because a couple of years into Facebook, something happened that changed the direction of how I was thinking about things. And I became more deliberate about what I wanted out of my career journey. Up to that point, I felt maybe I was floating a little bit on letting the career dictate my direction versus me dictating the direction I wanted to go. And so with Facebook, I made a few deliberate decisions. I actually changed role in Facebook quite substantially 3 times over a 7-year period. Each time recognizing when it was time to change and making that decision. the decision to leave Facebook was completely based on the experience I had had a couple of years prior. And it was a very deliberate one in terms of what I wanted to get out of my time after Facebook. And then, being honest, the joining Workday, I actually was working for myself at the time as a consultant. And then again, somebody I'd worked with in Facebook and who I'd loved working with approached me and said, I'm building this new thing in Workday. Would you be interested in coming in? What has been interesting in every single case of all of the larger companies I've joined, the common thread has been two things. It's been the people I know from previous roles and how they've viewed me in those roles, but also ambiguity. I always refer to myself, I'm a builder. Every single company I joined, every single function didn't exist when I joined. I joined usually as the first person to help figure something out. I was given a gray area, or I got asked a very vague question and asked, can you go and solve this? And I think my software engineering side kicked in terms of, yes, this is a problem to solve. So I really look at it in terms of the people I've met and the network who helped me get into the companies. But every single time it's been entering into something where it doesn't exist. The team doesn't exist, the function doesn't exist, and part of my job is to help figure that out. Yeah.
Gotcha. All right. It's super interesting. I remember first joining Facebook. At that point, there was no Workday or Workplace. So, you connected with people on Facebook, and to your point, it was incredible how much of a social company the company was, right? It's always kind of stood out for me as I've moved along in my career as well, that social network is powerful. But I think perhaps maybe not as powerful as maybe that health moment that I think maybe we should double click on. And you mentioned very clearly in your career, there's this point, right, that changed everything, which was your brain hemorrhage. I know you've spoken about it quite openly on LinkedIn, at least from what I've seen, about how it reshaped not just your health, but your views on work, success, and what really matters to you.
Yeah.
So, I mean, as much as you're comfortable with sharing with us, I mean, do you want to maybe just tell us what you can?
No, I'm happy to. I often overshare at this point. So yeah, I always go back to I was probably the healthiest I'd ever been at that point in my life. And then just out of nowhere one day, so I was in Facebook at the time, and literally getting ready to play football one day, I just felt a bit dizzy and thought maybe it was just a bit of a bug or a flu or something. So continued to get ready and go and play football, and then realized something was very wrong because I ran into the fence 3 times. Then when I went to tell the others I was playing with that I needed to go home, I actually found it quite hard to speak. So I, the next day or two, kept an eye on things, really wasn't feeling great. So I ended up eventually going to my doctor. And the long story short was that they found I'd had a brain hemorrhage, a very small bleed in a very very delicate part of the brain. I won't give you the exact terminology, but it's burned into my brain at this stage, and it affected speech and balance. And I was exceptionally lucky. I was in hospital 12 days. I was actually back at work 5 weeks later. And it had some impact. So I was very lucky in terms of I didn't need surgery, and over time, it actually ended up resolving itself. So the hemorrhage itself, the scar tissue actually dissolved. But it had a few things. One of the ones that is often a bit of a challenge, it affected my speech. So I had to relearn how to talk properly. My speech patterns are very different, and you'll actually find even now, I don't make as much eye contact as I used to when I'm talking to somebody, simply because I need to focus on what's next. I often joke that it's a little bit like having permanent subtitles, where I'm planning ahead in terms of what I'm going to say, because if I don't, my speech will actually slur a little bit. But outside of that and a few other things, I was exceptionally lucky. But the big thing was that for 5 years, they kept testing to find out what had happened, and they never found a reason. They really just eventually, you know, I got discharged from the medical system for that. They had done what they could. They had tested things for 75, 80 different things, including some very rare things. Never found a reason. But it shook me to my core simply because, you know, I was very lucky to walk away from it, but not having a reason why it happened meant they couldn't say this won't happen again. And so I returned to work with this thought, like, what am I doing with my time? What happens if it happens again? And what happens if the next time it's worse? And that kind of just shaped everything. As I said, when I talk about being a failed careerist, that's why I'm a failed careerist. I stopped worrying about moving up and progression and the next level. And what was interesting was I returned to Facebook braver. I made riskier decisions, braver decisions. I often quoted, like, life is too short, you don't know what's coming. And I actually did really well. But soon after, I found myself slipping back into the rat race, into that old mentality. And I remember it distinctly, where we had a management offsite in Dublin, and I hadn't got promoted, and I was very unhappy at not getting promoted. And everyone was really nice to me. They're like, no, Ivan, it's coming, you know, you're pushing in the work, it's coming. I went home that night and I just felt utter disappointment. And it's a quote I still use today, which is, I relearned to talk. And what did I use my voice for? To complain about not getting promoted. And so over the next couple of days, I reviewed my financial situation, and I just thought to myself, okay, let's do something different. And I quit Facebook and I quit my career. I went back into education. I traveled. I took a break with a very distinct purpose: try and figure out how I could be happier. And while I'm still figuring that out, you know, I managed to figure out a lot of what drove me, what I thrive doing, what I don't like doing, how it all fits together. And then essentially that propelled my career in quite a different direction. Yeah.
All right. Wow. That's a lot. I will be honest. It's a lot to take in. And I think quite interesting, you know, it seems like something that happened in your personal life spills over into your work life. It appears to have quite a positive effect initially into your work life. Initially, you said you became riskier, you pushed more boundaries, but then it's almost like your life kind of called you back, that personal element, saying, hang on, what's the purpose? What's it all for?
And that's exactly it. But what I've learned, though, in my case, was it was an anchor event in my life. It's something that I'll always refer to. And look, everyone has their own challenges in life. And I've learned, you know, you don't get to say somebody else's challenges are better or worse. Everyone has their own things to deal with in their own ways. And in my case, what I realized was, you know, maybe I am wired to slip back into some of those old patterns, old thought patterns. But what I do have now is this anchor to always hinge myself on, just to hold myself accountable a little bit. So when I find myself in some of those old patterns, when I find myself angry or frustrated at something, I have this thing I can think of and go, well, hang on, you had this happen to you. This thing that you're facing right now is nothing. You know, another quote I like to butcher, you know, I'm learning, don't sweat the small stuff, and in the end, almost everything is small stuff. So yeah. Fair.
It's interesting you bring up anchors, actually, because in your story, I'm guessing you're talking about one, but to me it almost sounds like there were two, right? The day of the brain hemorrhage, but then from that point you kind of continued working, and you didn't. I think you said 5 days later you were back in the office, right? And then for me it seems like the second anchor was really then when you actually took that purposeful step back from your career, from the rat race, and saying, so, I mean, if I was to ask you, which one is the anchor actually? Was it that time that you gave yourself time back to say who you really are, or was it that moment where you realized life is not what you think it is?
That's a very good question. I think it's both. Because for the hemorrhage in particular, I I turned into a very functional person. I remember it very clearly, which it was like, okay, this thing has happened. And for the weeks and months afterwards, it was all just very functional, get through things. So I didn't think ahead. I didn't worry about it. It was simply what's next, what's next, what's next. And I think it was only, I think some of the bravery, etc., came almost unconsciously after I got back to work, etc. But I think you're right in terms of there's almost like a conscious and an unconscious anchor. The unconscious was the hemorrhage and how I dealt with it, but the conscious was that decision. As I said, I was, privileged to be in a position to be able to do that. Not many people can afford to walk away from their career, given either financially or commitments in life, whatever it might be. And for me to be able to do that, as I said, changed an awful lot. So for me, it's almost like the two anchor points, conscious and unconscious. Yeah.
Got you. All right. That's interesting. Thanks for sharing. And I'd love to know, maybe we can like double click a bit more on the conscious anchor point a little bit.
Yeah.
And assuming that was a little bit more on like a taking a step back, so a little bit on pace. Obviously, pressure wise, I assume that artificial work pressure was gone, but I'm sure a existential pressure suddenly comes in of who am I? What am I? What is this all about? Kind of kicks in, and then purpose ultimately. I mean,
definitely. As I said, when you're a workaholic and you don't work anymore, you need something. And definitely, I thrive on structure and work. And when you don't have that, you need to build it. But that's exactly it. I mean, I went into it thinking I will take a certain period of time off, a few months, and I'm going to try to figure out how to be happier. But that was it. I didn't know what else to do around that. So for me, it was going down the route. That's it. I put structure in there. I went back into education, did courses in web development, something I'd done in my software engineering days, and data analytics. And interestingly, the decisions I made over that time period that I took off informed the future. So for example, I was interested in data. I did a course in data analytics. A lot of my career afterwards ends up being in the analytics space. And my most recent role has actually been setting up an analytics team. So a decision I made back in that time off has led to what I was doing most recently. But it's a funny one because you're in this area where you don't have any structure, you don't really have much of a plan, and then you also have this time thing hanging over your head, which is I need to figure, and I was guilty of this. I was a little bit like, I need to figure out how to be happy in the next 6 months, because then in month 7 I need to go back into the working world. It didn't work out that way. But what it did give me was just, honestly, I know it sounds twee, time to just be myself without a working world and figure out what I like doing and what I didn't like doing. I experimented on a few things. I went traveling quite extensively for a while to figure out a few things there. Ended up doing a few of these courses, figuring out what I wanted, and there's lots of conversations, talking to lots of people that I knew as well. And what I realized was what I often say was there was no sudden light bulb moment. I didn't suddenly go, right, I'm going to start my own company, or I'm going to go off and start a charity. There was none of that. It was just this gradual recognition, I like this, I don't like that, and just putting all the pieces together. And what was interesting was, when I took that break, I think one of the most telling things that happened, and it was a very interesting one to watch. I took that break and I started to figure out and think, okay, this is what I'd like to do. I didn't know for sure. When I re-entered the working world, I'd been out a long time. And so I went from initially going for jobs I was interested in to panic setting it. And I definitely ended up applying for a couple of jobs that were a little bit like old Ivan jobs. And I remember, going quite far in one process with a really great tech company, and then just thinking to myself, what am I doing? It's like, this isn't why I took that break. This isn't why I walked away to go back into what I used to do. Pulled out of the process. Company weren't too happy, and I was like, they were very good about it though. And what was interesting was soon after that, I ended up meeting somebody again I used to work with, got me into, will you help this other company, the consultancy side, which led to Workday and my career there. But there was no moment where it all came together. There was no deliberate, it was more just taking a step back and just going, okay, just let life be a little bit, and then let's do a few things and figure out if any of these point in a particular direction. And some did, and have definitely informed what I've done since. But I also say it's not as if I finished that time off with a distinct, this is what my life is going to be. I'm still figuring that bit out. Yeah.
Okay, got you. It's good to know. I haven't had an opportunity to take a break myself in that way, but it's, I guess for a lot of us in our minds, we build it up to be this, I'll give 6 months and I will find absolute clarity. And it's just good to hear that that may not necessarily be true. Marlene, would you like to ask something?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, by the way. Great conversation. Lovely hearing you. I actually have a few questions for you, Ivan. So hello, Anthony, and hello, Mariana. So actually, Ivan, I discovered your profile on LinkedIn. So someone who essentially is part of my network who would like to on one of your posts. And essentially I kind of discovered it a few months ago. So and then I've kind of been reading what you've been posting and so on. And one thing that struck me is you're quite transparent and open, and at times you write in a very vulnerable way. So I'm very curious, why did you take that approach? Why to be so transparent in front of so many people? And what value do you derive from that? So does that kind of serve a particular purpose, or does that help you personally, and so on? So curious to hear your thoughts, and then I have a few follow-up questions on that.
No, so thank you very much. So I think you're right. So what's interesting is this: between having the brain hemorrhage and the first time I ever talked about it on LinkedIn in a public forum was 6 years. I wrote and deleted the same article again and again and again because I was continuously worried about the impact it would have, what will people think, and the impact on my future career. And I had friends as well who would ask me that question, saying, be careful, you are putting something out into the world that you cannot take back, and you may have future employers going, oh wow, no, we're not going to be bringing this guy on board for these reasons. But what it was this, is I see it more and more now. So when I worked in Facebook and my prior role in Workday, one of the things I was heavily involved in was Movember, and all of the work around kind of what Movember is for men's health and cancer. And I've been through my own health challenges, and I've seen enough people go through their own as well. And what I realized was it's important to talk about vulnerability and illness and mental health. And what I found was very few people talk about their experience. Everyone supports it. Nobody ever talks about it. Nobody ever says, yeah, this is me. This is me. I finally start to see more now where people are opening up. But it was very much like everyone supporting the idea of talking about it, but not actually talking about it. So after a long time, I was like, you know what? I need to talk about this. What I've always said was, if me being open and vulnerable about what happened to me helps one person, that's worth it. Whatever impact it's had on the rest of my career, if it can help a single person, that's worth it. And what has been nice is it has. I've had people reach out to me, as you said, Marilyn. People who find me on LinkedIn have contacted me and wanted to talk about their own experiences with me, and I think a lot of it has come from that. So for me, it was purely, I felt that me talking about a lot of this could help people, and also I wanted to, because it's a big part of who I am. I go back to one thing which what's important to me is authenticity now. It wasn't. When I was a careerist, when I was trying to get to the next level, there was a personal Ivan and a work Ivan, and maybe I wasn't bringing my full self to work, to use that old terminology. I definitely do now, whether it's good or bad. I think a few people in companies afterwards have kind of dealt with the very real Ivan in a working environment. But the big thing was that it was, I felt that, you know, it could help and how important it is, and it's still vital today. You know, I still look at some of those statistics around mental health, around illness, and I feel people can and should be talking about it a lot more, both in a personal environment and in a work environment, because it's increasingly part of who people are. Yeah.
No, that makes sense. Thank you for that. I think kind of maybe a bit of a broader conversation. Do you think they'll continue to be, because you've talked about how, you know, we have this culture obviously of talking about it in the workplace and, you know, kind of espousing those values, but not necessarily do it. Do you think we'll continue to do that? I'm speaking more generally in the sector, because I was reading an article this morning on Medium where someone was talking about the change in the tech sector more generally, and how, you know, it went from a period of time when there was a lot of support and so on provided to tech workers in general, to an environment where now things are a bit different. And so some of those principles were very much around creating workplaces which, you know, kind of enabled people to operate at their best, both mentally, but also kind of, you know, cognitively in that sense. So I'm curious around your thoughts on, I don't know if I think have we lost you?
Perhaps. I can hear you still.
Let me just, yeah, there we go.
Yes, no, absolutely. So, you know, curious to hear your thoughts, because obviously you've got lots of experience, many different tech companies and so on. Do you think we'll continue to have that focus, or do you think we'll become a little bit more like maybe other sectors where, you know, kind of you know, some of these topics are a bit less central to the way you deal with your day-to-day?
No, that's a very good question. I think it's still going to be essential, especially in the tech environment. I think, like, you're exactly right. I think in a lot of tech companies and bigger tech companies, you're seeing things find a bit more of a balance. I think a lot of that is just driven by the environment that the world is in right now, and what needs to happen for some of those companies to continue to be able to do business and to do what they need to do. What I still like, though, is I don't see a reduction happening in that support, and I especially don't see it with smaller tech companies. I think what I like to think is it isn't about what the company decides to offer, it's about what the people they hire demand they offer. And I think that when I look at, you know, the next generations of workers that are after us and after them and even after them, I think they're only ever going to get more demanding about this sort of support. They're not going to stop talking about this stuff. And as an employer, if you don't offer a forum for them to talk and support, they'll find a different employer. So I think it's really going to be more people driven than anything else. I definitely can see a little bit of a shift at the moment, but I think it's going to be driven by the people who come next, and they're not going to settle for going back to a world of separating the me at home and the me at work.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. I was also thinking, just you know, you've talked recently of a transition for you professionally, and kind of you know, moving to different pastures. So I'm curious, and you know, feel free to kind of say, you know, don't want to answer or not. But I think you were talking about resilience earlier, and you were talking about, you know, kind of having a moment where you panic applied for a role and then you pulled back from that. So I'm curious, how do you deal with, you know, natural fears that such a change bring, you know, kind of to an individual, just a person? Because I think everyone goes through some of those transitions, especially if you come from especially, I mean, we've talked about the current environment where things are quite, very, there's a lot of change happening in the wider economy and all that kind of stuff. So how do you deal with that? From your past experience, what has worked for you and what worked less well?
So that's a very good question. So yes, like I am, over the last, let's be honest, over the last few years, look, we've seen all the layoffs happening in the tech companies, and I've seen so many of my own friends impacted by that. The way I look at it is this, is fear is natural about this, and worrying about this is very natural. But when I look at anyone I know who has been impacted over the last 3-4 years by a lot of the changes in the tech sector, almost everyone is in a new role somewhere. They've all found somewhere to land. They've all found their next step. And to be honest, in a lot of cases, I'm beginning to think people are happier in that next step as well. And I know it's a very twee thing to say, and I often, and here's the thing, it scares me sometimes over what could happen in that next step. But I think you kind of have to tell yourself, you know what, it will work out. It will. It has for anyone else I've seen so far, and as uncomfortable as it is at the time, it will resolve itself. And in the majority of cases where I've seen this happen to people I know over the last few years, it has resolved itself very well for them. And so it's more just trusting that is possible. I'm not going to say it's going to happen because it needs work. I've seen those people worry and panic, and I see them go through weeks or months of trying to figure this out. And I've seen them carry commitments, whether it's mortgage or a partner or kids, whatever it might be. There's plenty of real things to worry about when you're in that position of trying to figure out your next step. But I would naturally tend to be a little bit more on the realistic side of things, a little bit pessimistic at times, but let's say realistic. But even I'm just like, it will work out. It does. You have to put in the work, definitely, but the people are there, the networks are there to tap into, and if you trust it will work out, I think it will work out. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And on that topic of working out, so how do you see, because there obviously, kind of I do think that especially with changes like AI and so on, the sector will continue to evolve. There will be, kind of more hiring sprees in certain parts of the sector and less so in others. So that kind of up and down is going to continue at least for the next few years. So what would be, for kind of your advice, I mean, from your perspective around how do you build a sustainable career in the sector? Like, how do you create, because I'm almost thinking, I was discussing with a friend yesterday, we were just thinking, actually, you almost are in a place where you have to think, you have to think about you as a person, almost kind of offering your services to a company, and then continuing, kind of you as a person and as a service provider, that needing to continue no matter who you provide that service to. We're almost in that position, which is, I come from a consulting background in the past, and that's a little bit what you do as a consultant. You kind of offer your services to a consulting firm, and then you continue towards whether you do internal consulting or external. So I wonder if, from your experience, do you think that's going to be the future of working in tech? Like, having to think about yourself as a free agent, so to speak, who's delivering services and whose services may no longer be needed, and therefore you need to kind of find other customers and so on and so forth. Yeah, just curious what your thoughts on that.
So I think so, but like anything, it's a very good question. I think it is going to go down that route where you will need to pitch yourself. You will need to be very succinct in the value you can bring to a company. I don't suddenly foresee a world where we're all in a gig economy, going around place to place. So obviously AI is changing things, and for somebody who has been, I think I got my first computer when I was about 5 or 6 years old. So I've been in technology for an awfully long time, or interested in it.
Yeah.
I've seen the changes that come with each stage, and the AI one is the fastest one I've ever seen. Like it's crazy to see how fast it's happening. But at the same time, while it is happening very quickly, I do feel that, at the end of the day, the area we're in can sometimes be a little bit of an echo chamber. And so we're being told to almost, your AI skills need to go from 0 to 100 very quickly. They don't. It's more about figuring out how it fits into what you do. I know I sometimes have arguments with people around this. There's a lot of stuff that tech employees do that AI cannot do. Yes, when you look at some of the roles that are out there, they can be replaced, but often they can just be enhanced. It's going to be about who can use technology and AI to help them do their job better than anyone else. But then when you look at, and I often put myself in this position, like most of my career has been going in to solve a gray area. AI can't quite figure that one out yet. You can't go to AI and go, build a function to do X or Y. You're always going to need that creative spark at the moment. Now, AI will obviously catch up, but I do see it going down the route of, while not maybe a gig economy, I think we're going to see shorter tenures in company, to be honest. It's interesting because the more I look at a lot of the folks I know from Google or from Meta, or even from Workday, long tenures, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 15 years. I know people who were hit by the layoffs in Google and Meta who had been there 20 years and hit that number.
Wow.
I don't know if I can see a world changing where it isn't that anymore. It's now going to be shorter stints. But I think it will go back into, being able to really clearly verbalize the value that you can bring to a company, going in, doing that, bringing that value, and then packaging that up and maybe then bringing it somewhere else. Almost like a consultancy type approach.
Yes, that makes sense. I think so can I challenge you on that point? I have a bit of a challenging question on that. So don't you think, though, that potentially mirrors, obviously to a smaller scale, what gig work was, right? So because essentially the whole point of gig work was, if you take Uber, right? So you take the industry, what you had was people who would kind of take a bit of a mortgage to kind of buy a taxi license, and who will essentially keep that license probably for their whole life. And therefore had very long tenures, right? So they had relationships sometimes with taxi customers who they would, routinely, take to the hospital, do these things. So you had that kind of long tenured kind of in the taxi space. But now what you're looking at is shorter, right? So it's kind of instant. You get this person, they join, you drive them somewhere, and then you leave. And then every day is a new day as an employee or as a service provider to Uber, right? So kind of your work as a taxi has kind of shortened from maybe an entire career all the way to potentially 1 or 2 days a week. And then you do something else or you do something else. So if I may kind of challenge that perception, don't you think going from longer tenures to shorter tenures, even though obviously we're talking about months, we're not talking about days, don't you think that kind of slightly mirrors some of that? Curious of that.
No, you're right. It does. But I also think you need to look at the job involved as well. So a lot of the gig economy side of things, it's a very encapsulated service, A to B. That's it. I think it mirrors well into when a company needs an encapsulated service. We need a marketing campaign for X. Build a marketing campaign out. I don't think it translates as well into if I look at myself as the example, and when I joined Facebook, we need to set up account management as a function in EMEA for Facebook ads. That's not something that is you go in, you set it up, and
absolutely.
you come back out. It evolves over time. The nuance of figuring all of this out, the scale. Now, once it's up and running, can you become a bit more interchangeable? Yes. And in fact, what I often say is, in my career, I've gone in to set something up. And I remember one of the best managers I had in Facebook talked to me at length about this and said, Ivan, like, how will I know when it's time that you're interested in, you're looking elsewhere, or your role might be? And I said to her, I was like, when it's up and running. I don't thrive on taking something running and keeping it running and just don't break it. I thrive on building it, and once it's built, you get somebody else to take it over, and then I move off on it. But in terms of the gig economy, if it's a very defined task of A to B, I think so. But I think a lot of companies are still trying to figure out that bigger, we just need to figure this out and build this. Now, over time, as you do that, elements of it will become A to B, and then that's where the gig side kicks in a little bit. But I think for a lot of them, there's still that need to think creatively to build something initially. Yeah.
No, that makes sense.
So maybe as we're coming up on the hour, and this feels like a good perhaps ending point, right? If this conversation were going to be the beginning of someone else's next chapter, in the context of having everything you've learned in this discussion that we've had with Marlene as well, what would your advice be? What would you want someone to really walk away with if you're on the precipice of change?
Yeah.
Where do you go? What do you think makes sense?
Well, over the last few years, I've really become a believer in flow. Essentially, when you get involved in something that you're passionate about, where you work on it, where time just passes, where it's effortless, where the action to get something done is effortless, and the end results just seem to come out of it. And what I believe now is that when you find something you love doing that embodies flow, and if you're in a position to be able to do as much of that as possible, it can lead to some pretty amazing places. I really feel that the moment I stopped worrying and focusing on career progression and moving to the next level, and the more I just focused on working on a day-to-day basis on something I really enjoyed doing, my career progression came from that. I really do look at it in terms of when as I said, I worked as a consultant, I really enjoyed it, but I use Workday as a really good example. For years, I got to build something that didn't existed in there without being told we needed to do X or we needed to do Y. And the deeper I got into it, the more I enjoyed doing it, the better I seemed to perform. And I think now it's trying to find a balance. As I said, it's easier said than done. I was lucky enough to be able to take the time to even start figuring this out. But for me, it's really about, if you want to progress and move within your career, two things. Number one is lateral movement is sometimes as good as upward movement. It can drive you in very different ways, and it can accelerate what you might want out of your job. But as I said, when I stopped worrying about moving to the next level is when all of a sudden I actually started to move to the next level. Yeah.
All right. Interesting. So by not focusing, you somewhat find focus and purpose, right? When you're
exactly.
That's wonderful. Ivan, thank you so much for taking the time this morning to chat to us. And I hope we get to do the session again in the near future. It's a lot more questions and a lot more learning.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I'm going to stop the recording, and I'm going to leave the meeting open. So if you want Marlene, you can keep on the conversation if Ivan has more time. Anthony, thank you so much for your time. You can stay if you want, or you can leave. And well, yeah, now I'm going to stop the recording. So
Grand, thank you. Yeah, I thought like let's try and wrap it up on the hours that the recording is kind of like self-contained.
yeah, exactly.
I wasn't meaning to stop the flow.